Yes. Good night to all alternate viewers. How happy I am to be here with you yet again on another Thursday. Here I was given an introduction and I was muted. So I want to thank you all again for coming on to the show. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We had a really good show last week. A show that is still trending at some high numbers, some riveting discussions with Mr. Kimar Safri and the conversation on homelessness. Right now, that conversation is dominating the public space as the current opposition leader of Barbados posed some questions. And today's front page on the Barbados Today, and I really wish I could pull that up that we could see. Today's front page on Barbados Today features a spread on the opposition. Ooh. Today's Barbados Today features a spread with the opposition leader of Barbados, Mr. Ralph Dorn, and our guest last week, Mr. Kimar Safri. And there was definitely some discussion going on between the two. So we, at Alternate Views, take our credit as it relates to formulating conversations, structuring conversations. Tonight, we are not getting into what or any discussion surrounding the comments of other person, but we just wanted to highlight the fact that alternate views is becoming a thought driver in Barbados as it relates to public discussion, as it relates to public discussion and how alternate views sets the trends for national conversation. So I want to give the alternate viewers a definite round of applause and a big thank you for tuning in to the program, and thank you for your continued support. So I just wanted to show you what exactly I was speaking about. Mr. Safri here and Mr. Thorne, two good gentlemen in my estimation. Uh, so I just wanted to show you what was happening publicly in Barbados for our international audience as well as it relates to alternate views leading and being a thought driver on national conversations, national policies. Right now, we are having an ongoing discussion in the country about the estimates and budgetary proposals, and the opposition leader um, is in the well along with other government officials and public officials. We're seeing public servants coming into the well and being probed with questions to justify how the budget allocations are prepared, what are the future plans, what are the current plans. And that is why we're here this evening, because we have Mr. Carlos Forte, uh, economist, Barbadian, but he's based in Canada. You may know Mr. Forte from contributing regularly to the public space in Barbados. Uh, Mr. Forte has been on David Ellis's Sagicor business for quite a lot. He's contributed on public panels. I myself have been on a few panels with Mr. Forte, so I know the extent and the depth to which his knowledge goes about the Barbados economy, not just Barbados, but the wider Caribbean and internationally as well, as Mr. Forte is based in Canada. Um, and he could give us some more information about his profile. But we're here this evening and we want you to like, we want you to share. Let's have a really good discussion this evening. So far, we're up at 61 persons. So I want to remind you all to share as wide as possible. I just want to say good night to those persons I'm seeing in the comments quite early. Our neighborhood dog is with us again early. in the discussion to say hello to us all. So we should say hello to the dog as well and thank him for constantly tuning in uh, Alternate Views every Thursday. Um, so let me say hi to you all in the comments. We are saying Annette Wood, and she was here from 6:55. Thank you, Ms. Wood, for tuning in to Alternate Views. We're always happy to have you here. We look forward to your probing questions that you do ask every Thursday. Uh, Square 4, thank you constantly for your support. We don't know what we would do without you, the viewers. So we want to thank you, Square 4, for your continued support. We feel the love and we reciprocate that love back over uh, to you. Sir Alfred Benjamin, I hope you can hear me now. You were saying earlier that you couldn't, uh, but I'm hoping you're hearing me now. We have Square 4 saying that he's excited with anticipation of listening to Kimar and Mr. Ford, two young and brilliant minds. Mr. Ford is one of my favorite economists. I look forward to hearing his analysis on the budget in Barbados today. Sharon O. Peace and blessings to you as well, Sharon. Good night. Thank you for tuning in. Rachel Thornhill. Good night to you, Doriel Clark. Welcome to the show, Doriel. Marilyn Pinnock. Thank you, Marilyn, for tuning in. Marietta, hi, and thank you once more. Clayton Vaughn, hi, good night to you. Welcome to Alternate Views. St. Chad's, welcome. ADG, welcome to Alternate Views. Thank you all for tuning in. Emerson Bob, thank you and welcome. He's saying good night to both myself and Mr. Fort, hailing from the United Kingdom. And Judith Ann Clark, thank you for tuning in as well. We quite appreciate the fact that you have your notifications turned on, that Alternate Views will be coming directly to your phone. So thank you all. Don't forget to like, don't forget to share, everybody. Just like and share as broad as possible. Let us have a very good discussion. So far, the numbers are building very nicely. Uh, we're up at 78 persons so far. So I want to encourage you to go on and share the link even further. We have Mr. Carlos Fort waiting. He's here already. He's in the background, so we're going to bring him in any moment now. And let's get the discussion going. So, this is Alternate Views. We always have to mention our platforms. Alternate Views is in book form. So, for those persons who may not know of Alternate Views, this is my publication here for Alternate Views, Barbados' Economic Road to Republic. Quite a handy book. And this book is an extensive analysis of the Barbados. Yeah, Sean, cool. Hi, good night to you, Sean. Welcome. As you know, Alternate Views is an extensive publication speaking to the Barbados economy. This book was done or written by myself. I did not have any help. I wrote it, but I had a publisher whose name was Reno Calendar. May the Lord rest his soul. Both him and his wife, Margot Durant Calendar, who assisted in the publication of it. But this is solely the thoughts and the produce of Stuart and Perkins Caribbean, where I would have done all of the research under that particular company's banner. And Stuart and Perkins, along with Alternate Views, has been doing quite a bit of work in the economic space. And we want to keep the world, because we're not a local platform, we're an international platform, having persons from all over the world, even persons from international organizations such as the International Monetary Fund, the Caribbean Progress Studies Institute, uh, just to name a few. Persons from Canada, the Canadian Revenue Agency. We saw, or we're having a broader audience every time we come on to the platform. But that is enough for me. I've been talking for almost 15 minutes now, and I want to get Mr. Fort in uh, this evening. So, Queen McQueenist. Some very interesting names. Welcome to you. Thank you for tuning on to the show. Pat Eastman and Everton Hunt. Welcome to Alternate Views. So, no longer ado, I want to bring Mr. Carlos Fort in on the platform and to say good night to Mr. Fort and to welcome him to Alternate Views. So, audience, I want you to give Mr. Fort a very huge and loving and warm welcome this afternoon as he uh, comes on to Alternate Views for his first time. Hopefully, this is not the last time he be here. We do have a very good working relationship with Mr. Fort, and we intend to draw on his knowledge and skills whenever time permits. So, over to you, Mr. Fort. Welcome to Alternate Views.
Good evening, Mr. Kimar Stewart. Good evening to your audience of Alternative Views. Thank you for inviting me to come on your platform and share my thoughts on the Barbados economy, as well as discuss any other topical issues that you may wish you to discuss. I, I have been put on notice that there will be or may be some questions from the audience later, and I will do my best to answer the questions as they arise.
Yes.
So, of course, currently in Barbados, the government is leading the debate on the estimates of revenue and expenditure, which is a statutory requirement. Once passed, it gives the legal authority for government ministries and the departments to spend money on existing programs and the implementation of new programs and priorities of the government. It also creates the forum, a rare opportunity for the public to get some insight into government's operations and government's priorities. And traditionally, those priorities would be challenged or cross-examined by the opposition. And in the case of Barbados, just a couple of weeks ago, just in time for the estimates, there's a new opposition leader who saw it fit to provide a public service to ensure that the country has an opposition voice to hold the government to account and promote and foster accountability in public life, which could only redound to the benefit of the nation at large. What are my preliminary thoughts on the estimates? So overall, as we economists refer to as the estimates as the real budget, the real, this is where we see government's revenue, its spending, and where there's a gap between its revenue and its spending, how that gap or deficit will be financed. And as I indicated earlier, it is commensurate with the prioritization of government's programs and policies, both existing and new ones. What is traditionally referred to as the budget in Barbados is more of an economic and financial policy statement, and that is expected to follow after this budget or after the current estimates of revenue and expenditure. What are the overall headlines? So the government is expecting to, or is forecasting that in the next financial year, which begins on April 4th and runs until March 31st in 2025, the government is forecasting that its revenue, its overall revenue, would increase by just about $450 million. The revenue that the government expects to collect in total in the next financial year, beginning in April, is $3.5 billion. And of that $3.5 billion, the government is in fact budgeting for a deficit, and as expenditure that is going to be allocated and likely approved, since the government has a commanding majority, is expected to be in the region of $4.6 billion in the next financial year. So the government is anticipating or budgeting for a deficit in the region of just over $1 billion. And that is an increase of about 120 to 140 million over the deficit that is expected in the current financial year. What we can see here is that...
Mr. Ford, could you slow down a bit? Just want you to expound upon some of what you said just now.
Yeah.
Because they're basically doing Econ 1002 here. So you say we have to give our audience the tutorial. Really, you said in your introduction, basically there's government revenue, then there's government expenditure, and then there's the deficit between the two. So government collecting 3.5 billion in revenue, which is mainly tax revenue, hardly ever non-tax revenue. What do you how do you expect government really? What is this an increase from last year? Our revenue numbers going up, or is this a fall or drop in revenue numbers?
Yeah, so the government is forecasting that its overall revenue would increase by just over $320 million. This is not on account of any new taxes, but is expected to be the result of a growing economy and, of course, rising prices. The extent to which prices are expected to rise over the course of the next 12 months or so is expected to moderate. And by that, I mean inflation is not expected to be as high as it has been in the past 2 years. Nonetheless, there is still expected to be some measure of inflation. That combined with a growing and expanding economy, government is forecasting that its revenue collection would be buoyed or would be increased by in the region of 320 million.
But growth in which areas? Which area, as an economist, professional economist, which areas do you see growth in Barbados that could give the government an additional $300 million?
Yeah, so again, there's a combination of growth and higher prices. More than 2/3 of government's revenue is earned from indirect taxes, so VAT, import duties, and so on. And those are basically what we call ad valorem taxes, a percentage-based tax on whatever the price of the commodity is. So once prices are rising, tax will increase, assuming that the same quantity of goods and services are being bought and produced within the economy. And in addition to that, the economy is growing on account of tourism, construction activity, both related to the tourism sector, but there's also some major projects that are expected to come on stream, in addition to uptick in the construction of houses in particular. From what I understand, the luxury market in Barbados is doing pretty well. So houses, the construction of new houses in that segment, you can think EXL development, which was sold by Carl Williams to a foreign investor. And that project, my understanding is there's some activity where homes are being built in that particular development. But across the length and breadth of the luxury market, which is a market that mainly caters to expats, that would be foreign nationals, that work in the offshore sector in Barbados, as well as individuals, high net worth individuals that have a desire to live in Barbados. Those are the ones that tend to be the source or the drivers of activity in that particular segment. Of course, government also has a very ambitious housing program, which so far the performance falls way below its lofty ambitions. But the sensing is that there is enough, and if we go by the growth that is forecasted by the central bank or expected in this year, growth is being forecasted around 4% on account, again, of tourism activity, construction activity. And tourism is also a driver of activity in the wholesale and retail as well. The basic Economics 101 tells us due to the multiplier effect as well in terms of government spending, government's capital spending, roadworks, and other initiatives. I mentioned housing earlier. The uptake in construction activity, as more people are working and employed in that sector, they would in turn spend in the economy, and that would also drive some increase in activity or increase in commerce in wholesale and retail. So you get that knock-on effect. I don't have any misgivings about what is currently being forecast in terms of revenue. I think what is perhaps more of a philosophical question is, what does the government do with that expected or anticipated addition in revenue in the region of 320 million? What the government is telling the public from the estimates of revenue and expenditure is that money is going to be spent, and is going to be spent. Not only is it going to be spent, the government is going to have to borrow in excess of, not in total, but an additional, I think is over $120 million to close the gap in its spending over the revenue that is anticipated. Now, those are policy choices where the government is expecting its revenue to increase by 320 million in the next financial year, in circumstances where the country is heavily taxed, particularly on the indirect taxation side, on account of a higher cost of living over the last 6 years or so, particularly last 3, on account coming out of COVID. A legitimate question could have been, should the government provide tax relief to the public? Not necessarily in the full range of 320 million, but maybe $50 million in tax relief, or $100 million of tax relief, or even $200 million in tax relief. That is the policy question. What the government has prioritized is basically, in order to implement its manifesto commitments and its budgetary commitments from last year, it is going to be increasing spending that will absorb all of that 320 million in additional revenue that is expected, with some additional borrowing to finance the additional spending. And if you ask yourself by how much would government be spending in the next financial year, in addition to what is going to be spending in total in this current financial year, which is going to end at the end of March 31st. Well, the government is budgeting that its expenditure will increase by about $450 million in the next financial year. So that number dwarfs the 320 million in anticipated increase in revenue. And that will be broken down into capital expenditure and what economists call recurring or current expenditure. So government's capital budget, out of that 250 million, government's capital spending is being budgeted for additional increase of about 220 million.
Yes. Well, you heard it, the audience, because the questions are coming in fast and furious already, based off what you're saying. But I want to ask, but I want to make an observation first,
Sure.
because I am a real estate agent in Barbados, and you started off by discussing high-end property sales. You spoke to government's ambitious housing program. You said that government's high-end real estate is doing very well, and I could agree with that. Quite a few high-income or high-end properties are being sold uh, in the country. Um, we should not speculate that high-income earners usually buy those properties, or uh, businesses usually buy them for revenue purposes, right?
Yeah.
Uh, we know you persons don't usually buy those type of properties for dwelling purposes only, and I say usually, not in all circumstances. Some persons who have the extra revenue who can maintain those properties for dwelling house, they do so. But mainly in Barbados, those size properties are used for investment purposes, right? Um, so the investment side is going well. We had the Welcome Stamp program, uh, where persons are relocating into the country as well. So you're getting an uptick from in that area as it relates to property sales and property engagement. But on the other side, or on the I would say on the other side, where we speak to the layman, that realistically does not correlate to much for them. So you're looking at the layman onlookers who will say, well, those are properties priced outside of my budget. I could only dream. The only time I probably enter one of those properties is if I am the maid, or if I'm the cook, if I'm the if I'm the driver, which would essentially speak to uh, or shifting the conversation over to tourism, but we don't want to get there as yet. On the other side, we spoke about government's housing program. I gave an entire expose on the government's Hope housing program, which is a abject failure, basically. The program was intended to be rolled out sometime from around 2020. This is now 2024. I read the estimates and I did not see any budgetary allocation in it for the Hope housing program to be completed. Regulatory issues plague that project in terms of government not having title deeds to own the properties, own the land that the properties were intended to be built on. So we had some pushback, and as I said, I did not see any budgetary allocation for Hope, and that will lead into my question. We're not going to segue from what you originally said, but I just want to give you a question, and then we come back to
Sure.
your statement. Um, when there's no upfront allocation for a line item, for example, the whole project, there's something usually called a supplemental, right? For the audience, could you give us an idea uh, how would the government go about, given that upfront they have not dealt with the housing project financially? How would they go about now handling that later on in the year in terms of a supplemental?
Yeah. So, I mean, it is fully within government's purview to bring a supplemental, what is called a supplemental, to Parliament. And basically, it is where government may not have allocated for some expenditure, or expenditure may have arisen that wasn't anticipated. So if you think in terms of an emergency situation, for example, a government will bring that to Parliament to get the necessary or the legal authority to be able to have that money spent and dispersed and spent. And so that is not so much, I guess, an issue. Another factor could be that the whole project is, my understanding is, it is structured as a company that is owned by the government. So there could be some off-budget allocation, or like in the form of, for example, I'm not saying that this is the case, but you can have a situation where the government guarantees a loan for the entity to access capital for its construction purposes, that guarantee would hit government's books in the form of debt, but not in the form of expenditure or spending. No, again, I want to stress, I'm not suggesting that that is what the government is doing in this case. I'm just giving an example of the various possibilities in how an initiative like that can be financed, even though the allocation may not be identified explicitly in the current estimates of revenue and expenditure. It is my understanding that besides the obstacles to the project that you've identified, is that there have also been some material supply issues, and I'm not sure if that is related to the global supply bottlenecks that was previously being experienced. But my information is that contractors on the site have been plagued with a situation where workers show up to work, but they don't have enough materials to do the work that they would have planned to operationalize or execute. Another obstacle, I suppose, is that it is, I think, is public knowledge that the electricity grid has reached capacity for alternative energy systems. And a significant component of the whole project is the installation of alternative energy systems on the houses that are being constructed, with that revenue then being able to subsidize the cost of the house for the prospective buyer. And if that model is stalled, you can see how, the financial model for that project basically would be encumbered should the project go on in full steam ahead as was intended. So those are just some of the issues that I understand, at least, that the government. Sorry, a little distracted by the questions that came up, but I would leave it to you to direct or read or pose the questions to me that from the audience.
Yeah, we'll take some questions soon. But before we head that direction, we started a conversation, so we will get there. The audience is chomping at the bits to have a crack at Carlos. I obviously enjoy Carlos' contributions quite a bit. So he just explained a little bit about the housing aspect of it, and he used the term ambitious because it is ambitious. But that term ambitious that you use is constantly referenced in International Monetary Fund documentation, constantly. The Burt 1, the Barbados Economic and Recovery Transformation Plan. The IMF always says, every statement the IMF has issued on Barbados since 2018, they always use the word ambitious.
Yeah, it's a polite way of saying unrealistic.
Yeah, well, so you said ambitious, but you said some things there about government expenditure increasing. As far as I know, in the IMF program, and particularly BERT 2, we were supposed to continue the reduction of expenditures versus increased revenue measures in terms of taxation, right? However, we are seeing budgetary allocations which would increase government expenditure, which is contrary to the IMF program, right?
It's a
So,
reasonable observation.
yes.
I think the government has shifted to focusing perhaps more on the sustainability of its fiscal deficit, and the and targeting that longer term target of trending towards 60% of GDP regarding the debt or the stock of debt. And I think those two indicators or targets is perhaps what the government has shifted its posture on in terms of policy. And I suppose are some that get or have gotten a little irritated when I made the comment, but one of the unintended consequences of the coming out of COVID, where demand, particularly in developed countries, came back a lot stronger or quicker than supply was able to return. You got basically prices rising quite steeply, and then that was then compounded by the war in Ukraine and the sanctions on Russia, and other such factors. Now, what that has done is, because again prices have increased higher than anticipated, it meant that government had a windfall of revenue or increased revenue that they didn't anticipate. And that additional revenue gave the government what I heard the Prime Minister refer to recently as some more elbow room, so to speak. A return of growth in the economy is also would naturally increase revenues as well. And those two factors have combined to giving the government a little more space to spend while remaining or maintaining some fidelity to the commitments, or at least some of the commitments, or rather the targets of the program. I made the distinction of targets as opposed to commitments because, as you rightly indicated, the government committed to a lot of restructuring in the SOEs, or state-owned enterprises, also known as commercial statutory corporations, that are intended to reduce government's transfers to those institutions and thereby reduce government's expenditure. So you are correct in your observation. Government expenditure is rather than falling, is actually increasing. And I would hasten to point out that some of that expenditure is capital expenditure, and capital expenditure is basically things like building roads, a government investing in hotels or any other type of endeavor that builds capacity within the economy. And so capital expenditure is thought of as an investment. And half of that, roughly half of that new spending, a little under half, is due to increased capital expenditure. And that's fine. However, about 229 million or 230 million of that additional spending that the government is planning for in the next fiscal year is on account of new spending for current programs that are going to be reoccurring, both existing programs and new programs. And that could potentially be some cause of concern. It does run counter to, as you said, the commitments under the BERT program to reduce expenditure. But again, because government is anticipating a higher revenue than expected, that gives it some space or some room to increase its spending without compromising what I believe are the two main targets of the government with respect to the satisfying the commitments under the IMF and the BERT program, and that being a sustainable deficit, so a deficit that is small in the region of 2% of GDP, a primary surplus, which the government has been boasting about, but the truth is Barbados has ran consistently a primary surplus since independence, with the exception of the second term of the Stewart administration. So that is just standard, I would say, standard prudent fiscal management to have a primary surplus. And what do I mean by a primary surplus? That's basically your difference between your expenditure and your revenue, excluding any debt servicing costs or capital costs. So it is expected that a government should manage its affairs in a manner that it generates sufficient revenue from taxes and non-tax sources that it can cover its recurrent expenditure and have some money left over that can then be used to service debt or embark on expenditure. So this additional revenue that the government is anticipating has given it some flexibility to either increase spending or pay down debt or give Barbadians some tax relief. The government has chosen to increase its spending. And I suppose this is maybe typical of left-leaning or what are called governments that have a social democratic persuasion, where you I guess to run the risk of being pejorative, you can characterize that as government perhaps believing that it is better placed to spend taxpayers' money than taxpayers are able to spend their own money by receiving some measure of tax relief when government, for whatever reasons, project or forecast a windfall of additional revenue that it didn't anticipate. So this is really just a philosophical economic policy question. But those were the options that were before the government, either to increase its spending on its priorities, whether those priorities are political commitments, and that should not be a bad word, because you elect governments on the basis of certain commitments that they give in the throes of a campaign and their manifesto, and of course their budgetary commitments. And those commitments have to be financed, right? Either through additional tax revenues or through borrowing. And so the government has opted to go in that direction. I would, prefer, or would have preferred, to see some measure of tax relief or targeted tax relief to the Barbadian public, or alternatively just paying down the debt a little quicker. So those are just some observations.
Yes, well, thank you for extensive expose, Carlos. It was very eye-opening, nevertheless. But we want to say hello again to the audience. We're at about 238 persons, and we wanted them to like and share the page. We're having a very good discussion so far with Carlos Fort. I am learning a lot, having some rehash lessons as well. So thank you for that, Carlos. Um, we're going to engage the audience for a brief moment, and then we're going to get back to the discussion. So just wanted to say some shout outs and some good nights again to the audience. You're claiming, and we thank you for that claim in terms of viewership. Don't forget to like and share to as many persons around as possible. The conversation gets better with the more of us that we have in here. So at least send to 5 people, send to your group chats, send all over. Let us continue this conversation. So good night, viewers, once more. Good night to you, Mr. Barrow. And to know that you're watching the sea watching. Good night to you and your wife. Good night to Simone Daniel, Mr. Tyrone Nurse from St. John. Good night to you and to Romel St. Hill, uh, Vihoy. Thank you for coming on. Esther Blue, how are you? I hope you're doing well. Good night. Thank you for your question. Hello to the Beijing Eagle, Trevor Seeley. Uh, Welcome on. Trevor is a real estate agent right here in Barbados as well. We do have a broad network of real estate agents who tune on to the program. We have Joseph Cadogan, a very well traveled person. We welcome Joseph, FX Trading, Adrian Hines. I get quite happy whenever I see Adrian in the comments. So good night to you, Adrian. Good night, Fabian Yard. Welcome. I saw Dave Weeks in here. Good night to you, Dave. Uh, Welcome to the show. Good evening to Marcia Weeks and the entire Marcia Weeks loyal opposition members. We see quite a few of you uh, in our alternate views. So welcome to the platform alternate views. So we want to start taking how you're saying. Uh, good night, Tracy Barrow. Good night, Jay Holder. Tennyson Drakes. Good night to you. Marion Griffith. Good night to you both, and Stephen. Good night to David Waldron, Romeo Hinkson, and the entire alternate viewers. Mr. Fort, we're getting a swarm of questions here coming at you. So we're going to start to engage some of them in no particular order. So don't feel like I taking someone else's question and not taking your question. We're just taking them randomly because the comment section is flowing very fast. So I'm going to try to put your questions up. So Mr. Ford can answer a couple of your questions and you continue to engage. We have Simone Daniel here asking you, Mr. Ford, what proportion of government revenues are from corporate taxes?
I,
Yeah, I guess you will
if
have
you,
to
if
take a
you,
minute to find.
yeah, if you give
Yeah,
me a moment, I will
yeah. Go ahead
take a,
and in a
take
moment
a
we
quick
read.
look at the central bank report to give. Okay. I'm going to give
Yeah,
you a proportion off the top, but I'll give you a sense of the share of corporate revenue
yeah,
relative to other sources of government revenue.
yeah. Well,
Uh,
go ahead, and in the meantime, I would continue the comment until you find
yeah, so
exactly
I
what.
have it. I have it here.
Okay.
So corporate revenue is so in the well, the previous financial year, and it will average around this amount. So that's fine. It's about $550 million. Government's overall revenue. So this I'm looking at the fiscal year 2022 to 2023. Where corporate revenue is about $550 million. Government's total revenue is in the region of $3.3 billion. Right, so you can see there that's a relatively small share of government's overall revenue. The government does collect more from corporate taxes than it does from personal income taxes, which in that year sum about $393 million. But both those numbers are quite small compared to government's largest revenue earner, which is the value-added tax, and that number is just over $1 billion, and forecasted to be slightly higher than that in the coming financial year. But yeah, there you have it. Corporate taxes is I could do a quick calculation here, but is definitely somewhere in the region of about 20% of government's overall revenue. 550.
As I try to put it in the comments,
So it's about 16% of government's overall revenue, corporate taxes.
which as you said equates to about 550 million
Yeah.
for 2022 2023. Yeah. So we put it right here on the screen, but that's total revenue. So I didn't mean that one. I wanted this one, which is corporate revenue. Was around $550 million between 2022 to 2023. So Simone, I'm really hoping that that is definitely a help to the information could assist you in whatever you are seeking to find out. But here is the revenue figure: it's 550 million. We also said here that VAT totals around $1 billion, which is our biggest revenue earner, and then total revenue estimates about $3.5 billion overall. So there are the percentages. Well, you can work out the percentages very easy, as I should say, but those are the overall numbers that you could be able to go forward and having an analysis. Simone is saying, thank you for the answer. That's a very low number.
Yeah, so to put that into some perspective too, is that governments government has well, the current administration has shifted its revenue or its tax revenue focus to rely more on what we call indirect taxes than direct taxes. So direct taxes would be like personal income tax, um, corporate taxes, and then you would have taxes, other like pandemic levies and property taxes. Those would be the three major components of direct taxes. But most of government's revenue is from indirect taxation, which is VAT, excise duties, import duties, social responsibility levy, and so on. You also have the fuel tax in there as an example of an indirect tax. And the government collects about $80 million a year from the fuel tax. And just preempting any questions that may come since I mentioned the fuel tax.
Yes. Well, Kima, is it possible? Well, I am hearing Carlos very fine volume wise. But we have someone here asking for you to increase your volume, but I'm hearing you quite fine. So I don't know if that is a general problem where the entire audience is having volume issues or if it's just one person. Um, but we're gonna watch it and see what happens. But on my side, everything is okay. Any other persons having issues, please let me know so that we can have Mr. Ford rectify it as soon as possible. But again, thank you all for tuning on. Don't forget to like and share. We're at 248 persons so far. You're taking some questions directly from the comments. So far, we had a question from Simone Daniel. Uh, and we have a very interesting question here from Vihoy asking you, Carlos, as an economist, if you were advising the government, what would you tell them to do with the surplus and why?
So so it's not a surplus, as it's not government's run a deficit in the current financial year, and they're budgeting for a deficit in the financial year to come. However, I suspect what the person is asking is what I would have advised the government to do with the additional $320 million that is forecasted or that is forecasting to collect in the next financial year. And as I mentioned earlier, the various options at the government disposal, increase its spending would be one option, which this government has opted for. Another option would have been to pay down some of its debt. And another option, and by doing so, the government would have then been budgeting for a surplus, overall fiscal surplus, then pay down its debt. Another option could have been to provide the public with some tax relief. And I should hasten to say that the government has opted to increase its spending, but almost half of that additional spending is going to be capital spending. And capital spending is important. It is important that the government spends money on roads. It is important that the government spends money on building new capacity, whether that's a new geriatric hospital, or whether that is subsidizing a housing program. So capital spending is seen as investment in the economy. It is, if targeted correctly, it builds capacity for future economic growth. And the government is doing that with some of this additional revenue. And certainly that is one of the things that I would advise, that the government is doing that. But I would have liked to see some tax relief being given to the public who is bearing the burden of increased cost of living. And Kimar earlier mentioned I suppose the disparity, or where in the property market, where the luxury property market is doing well, but the property market in the middle and at the lower end is not performing as well to meet the needs of Barbadians. And I think that that is true of the overall economy in general, where it does appear to be the case, not just from an assessment of the overall macroeconomic situation, but my observations when I've visited over the course of the last 2 years, and also from speaking to friends and colleagues, it does appear to be a situation where those who are doing well are doing very, very well, living good, as he would say in vernacular terms. But then the majority appears to be really struggling, notwithstanding the fact that the economy is growing, and that is in large measure because the cost of living has risen so substantially in circumstances where we already had a country with a high cost structure and high cost of living. So those are some of the challenges that are confronting the nation right now, and tax relief is only but one option in terms of providing some ease to the general public with respect to the high cost of living.
Yeah, well, I hope that answers your question. We're going to take another question. If you want to follow up, please mention in the comments quickly, because we have so many questions coming in at Carlos. Whoa, but so far so good. Jehoda, most of the persons here are saying that everything is good on their ends in terms of audio, so I don't know if it is your end that is having some challenges. So could you look at it and let us know again, please? I want to ensure that everyone is hearing quite clearly. So just check it out on your end and come back in. Thanks. So we're going to take another question from the audience here, Carlos. And this one in particular, I have an interest in, so I want to make a comment before you go ahead on it. But it says here, how would this new housing project benefit local workers when the country will soon be opened up to all and sundry? Now, that is a very interesting question to ask. Now, why I say that is because happening in Barbados, the construction of houses are being issued to uh, a Guyanese construction company, and we are seeing other countries, well, no, not countries, other companies that do construction come in to the country. We're even seeing some of the local construction companies hiring non-nationals as well on the payroll, and local construction firms are crying out with the fact that they're being left out of the economic pie as it relates to the distribution of contracts to be able to build houses. Not speaking about roads and the mill and pave program like what we saw in the news, and speaking specifically now to the construction of houses. And we saw, and this is a chronic problem in governments, that there's this type of elite practice where a one company or two companies win majority of the bids to build government contracts. So we're having it on the local sphere where the hiring practices, the new labor practices of construction companies tend to leave out Barbadians in majority, bring in non-nationals to fill that role, and then also these companies are being invited in to come and build construction projects while bringing workers as well with them. And then also we're seeing development lenders like China. We know that when they usually lend, they also supply the labor uh, as well. And that would be my perspective on that. No, I would to say if there's benefit in it to having those type of newfound practices. I guess as a businessman, they would have some type of ideology as to why they would do something like that. Um, and then from the government's perspective, um, it'd be very interesting to hear what they would say as it relates to these new type of developing trends in a small developing economy like Barbados. So what are your thoughts about that?
I think it's a very interesting question. I would try to strike some balance with respect to my response. My understanding is not only from statements made by the government, but also from people that I've spoken to who are work in the construction real estate sector in Barbados. Um, Apparently, there is a shortage of skilled labor in the construction sector, and that may be on account of two factors that are interrelated. So the economy stagnated for at least a decade, where there wasn't much growth, there wasn't much activity in the construction sector. What happened between 2010 and 2020, according to the 2020 census, is that about 10,000 Barbadians left the shores of Barbados or died. I think of that number, most of those people are people who have left Barbados seeking an economic opportunity elsewhere. Moved to Canada, United States, UK. Some have moved to other countries in the region, and maybe even further afield. It is likely that some of those persons that have moved, some of that 10,000 people, maybe people who worked in the construction sector. You can imagine if that is an area where you earn most of your living. A decade is a long time to have not to have a sustained source of income. So I think the country may have lost people also who may not have moved, may have shifted and into other industries in terms of the career prospects. And so there do appear to be a real shortage in skilled labor in the construction sector, and therefore to address or alleviate that shortage, there would be a combination of people coming in from other parts of the region who have those skills. And to the extent that that is the case, they wouldn't be displacing Barbadians from construction from opportunities working in the construction sector. Kimar did raise a good point. However, if the pie isn't being spread wide enough, if only a few large companies are getting most of the contracts, particularly if they're government contracts, you can't control what private sector people give their contracts to. Then, it stands to reason that the economic activity, the incomes generated from that activity in the construction sector would not redound to the benefit of most of the people who ply their trade and earn an income in that sector. And that would be of some cause for concern. I do recognize that the government has to balance competence with, enfranchisement. And by that, what I mean is, we don't want to have a situation again where we saw in the Oinata administration associated with the Urban Development Commission in particular, when people were given contracts to build homes that had no competency or track record in building homes, and you get some wastage in public funds on account of that. So that balance have to be struck, but I certainly would endorse Kimar's sentiments that the government perhaps need to prioritize in all public procurement, economic enfranchisement, by ensuring that contracts aren't given to a select few, and that aspiring budding new entrepreneurs who can demonstrate the ability to meet the specifications of constructing projects competently, and of course existing contractors that may be small or medium size, that they have a fair shot. And one of the ways of doing that is to have an open tendering process that is transparent, where everyone has equal opportunity to bid, and provided that they have the competence, the specifications are clearly predetermined, documentation around track record and so on are provided for, rather than handpicking, or what appears to be handpicking certain companies. But the elephant in the room here on this issue and many other issues, and again, this is not a partisan comment, it's not unique to any particular administration or political party, is the role of campaign financing in public affairs. So it's something that I think the general public do not speak a lot or pay a lot of attention to. But the fact is that political parties need money to run political campaigns, and companies who are, giving donations aren't just doing it because they're benevolent and, want to see a particular party win. They expect some benefit in return, and you get governments, again, across political stripes, having to balance those interests when it embarks on projects or it engages in public procurement. So I think those two issues go hand in hand, and the public perhaps need to pay more attention to that particular issue when it comes to the issues pertaining to the question that I think it was Esther Blue asks, as it relates to the extent to which the bounty of economic growth in any particular sector, be it construction, tourism, is being shared as equitably as possible. And certainly, I think that we would expect and want that our governments in a democracy play the role where they balance private interests with public interests to ensure that the country overall benefits, and that there's a degree of income equality that is promoted and fostered by government policy, as opposed to government policy reinforcing inequity in economic endeavors.
What you were saying was very important, particularly the issue of campaign financing. I know there was a public issue recently. I describe it to be a public issue because we had a situation where the Minister of Transport and Works in Barbados had an issue where the minister was receiving a personal check from a company that the ministry traditionally give contracts to, right? So that definitely creates a conflict of interest. Whereas, as a if I was a lawyer or a legal brain, I would argue that you have a conflict of interest because we do not know if the standard of work that the company produces or uh, whatever standards the company can meet, there's no measurement to justify that. So if we take away the fact that the company did not donate, will the company still be able to get the contract? Uh, will the process for procurement still be open and transparent without the idea of having to hand over some type of investment to a minister or to a foundation, whatever? So it creates a problem where it's our opaque situation where we are left to question the fact that giving donations to ministers, do we consider that to be a bribe?
Um,
Um,
I think we can cut through a lot of the political fluff with respect to that issue.
right.
I agree with the Prime Minister in her assessment. The issue is open and shut. I do not agree with her conclusion. I think reasonable people would agree that should a similar scenario occur in the United States, Canada, or any of the developed countries that we aspire to become. The government has been touting the ideals of the country becoming world class. And if we are to be world class, we must conduct our affairs in a manner that is world class, and particularly in public policy. And the truth is, had the deputy prime minister um, found herself in a similar situation, operating within one of those world class countries, she would have been sacked and or forced to resign and subjected to whatever legal sanction for such a obvious and blatant conflict of interest. The issue is not that dissimilar from the situation that befell former Minister Donald Innes, for which he was charged and prosecuted in the United States, though not in Barbados. The issues there are almost identical, where checks were received, purported to be donation, but there was obvious conflict where the source of the check has been accorded some benefit or will be accorded some benefit in the portfolio for which the substantive minister have some responsibility for. The other issue is that I think even the government's spokespersons on the issue have acknowledged that had the integrity legislation that they pass been proclaimed, then the particular issue would have been subject to the law with the attendant legal sanction that would ensue. So quite clearly, it is a situation that cannot be justified or condoned in any way. And to my mind, it is crystal clear. It's a conflict of interest. To the extent that it's a practice that is common, as to one of the arguments that you've heard advanced on the issue, then it is a practice that needs to be rooted out. But again, the legislation that the current administration has passed with respect to integrity of public life, had it been proclaimed, this particular indiscretion would have been subject to legal sanction. And I think that is quite clear.
Well, thank you for your answer. Um, it gave me a lot to think about in terms of the structure of the Barbados economy. How could we proceed to ensure that the wider population gets a piece of the economic pie? Um, I often hear the term Reagan economics or Ronald Reagan economics, and we have some in political spheres, but we're not being political here, right? But in political spheres, we had accusations of persons practicing Reagan economics or trickle down economics, where you give large contracts to the elite, and then those elites would have the fiscal space to be able to hire or subcontract work out to the smaller companies. But what we're seeing developing is that the contractor now subcontracts work to himself, thereby excluding much smaller firms from gaining work. And the fact that a lot of the firms who gain government contracts have been known to donate campaign financing to political parties, and thereby hamstringing the administration to be able to revert back the largesse that were given to them to be able to do campaigning. So it raises a bigger issue really of campaign finance laws and reform to the current system. So the representation of the People's Act, purely from an economic perspective, should undergo some changes. And I'm uh, highly agreeing with Mr. Ford here that we really need to focus on the representation of the People's Act and how political parties could become tainted or have a prejudiced nature and their actions in the lead up to becoming an elected government, where situations would then arise, like what happened with the Deputy Prime Minister of Barbados receiving or allegedly receiving that check. So that is a gray area there that we really need to work on in terms of Barbados. This is a chronic problem we see all over the Caribbean as well. So we definitely need to work on that area so that we tackle the perception of corruption. And that leads into my next question. I'm taking the host's privilege now and to invoke my question. Um, there was a situation in Barbados where, in agreement with the International Monetary Fund, and according to the new legislation, which speaks to public procurement and government contracts, during COVID, the government agreed with the IMF to have a register, a public register of all government contracts, right? And those contracts were to be listed at Kaipo, right? Uh, the minister of, or in the Ministry of Finance of Barbados spoke extensively to the fact that the government was intended to be transparent. I even heard a clip this week which said that this current administration has been the most transparent administration ever in history of administrations. That's his comment. Not that we agree, but that is what he said. So that sent me to thinking that previously we put out some information in the public which spoke directly to transparency, integrity, and accountability in government and how it impacts on the economy and the perception of corruption. And Barbados agreed to have a public register of contracts that every contract over $1 million was intended to be listed at corporate affairs, uh, and this was mandated by the Burke Plan in agreement with the International Monetary Fund. And Transparency International, I don't know if you're familiar with that organization, Carlos, but Transparency International has said that COVID-19 was not only a health crisis but a corruption crisis. But I want to bring the conversation uh, much broader than COVID. We're just looking at governance at large now, uh, where we speak to a public register where you as an economist, Carlos, me as I, whatever, a lawyer, doctor, anybody could go to corporate affairs and say, I want to see the government contract for the construction of the houses at Hope. I want to see the government contracts for the Mill and Pave program. I want to see government contracts for the school meal service. And the list could go on. I want to see the public register of contracts for the jobs, right? To procure that. I want to see the public register of contracts for who built the accident and emergency uh, department at the QEH, who built the building at Harson's Point, to create high levels of transparency and accountability. No, I see all of that to say really that, and again, this is in agreement with the IMF and under the Memorandum of Understanding of Economic and Financial Policies. And the new Public Financial Management Act, along with the new Public Procurement Act, right, was rolled out in Barbados to be able to track expenditure in the country as it relates to public contracts. Now, I personally paid a visit to Kaipor, right, because the government rolled it out in 2021, and on May the 23rd, 2023, I personally went to Kaipo and I asked to see the public register of contracts. When I got there, the workers at Kaipo reacted like I was speaking French, German, Italian, Swahili, if need be, looking also lost as to what I was speaking about as it relates to public contracts being registered there. No, if you went by the rhetoric of the officials, they said that the register was there. If you looked at the plan also, they say that the government met that target as it relates to it having those contracts at Kaipo. Now, they said they personally went and they were not there. No, I have an issue with that because we're big on transparency. We're in arrangements with the IMF. We're borrowing from the World Bank. We're borrowing from the IDB, the European Investment Bank, and we have these large institutional investors who look on to Barbados, and they want to be able to know that the monies they have invested in this country is corruption free, right? simply, Carlos, what do you think about this public register of contracts?
Well, it's a good idea. Uh, Based on your description, I think that it sounds like, it's another piece of legislation that suffers from the follow through. I think if there's one shortcoming that Barbados has, which has been the case over the course of the past 30 to 40 years, is enforcement of legislation. The country is good at passing legislation. This government has passed a lot of legislation in a pretty short time. But then where are the regulations that stem from that legislation that are implemented? Where is the implementation or the resources that are needed where you set up a new framework that may require new systems to be put in place, additional staff may be necessary, or what have you. The IMF agreement required legislation to be passed, and legislation was passed. So in that sense, the target would be met. But it's the intent or the substance of the legislation that is more important. And bringing to bear transparency is helpful because it allows the public, whether that's the general public or interested parties or stakeholders, to be able to access information against which they can pose questions to the government or scrutinize the government to hold the government to account. But more importantly, where there's more transparency, even in politics, politicians want to manage what is called political risk. And therefore, if there's a possibility for any fallout that is going to be made public, it forces them to conduct their affairs in a manner that is more scrupulous, that is more above board, and so on. So that is one of the benefits of being more transparent. Being more transparent in of itself, however, wouldn't fix because you could have individuals who disregard public scrutiny, maybe prepared to face whatever consequences politically or otherwise. And that's where then you have enforcement mechanisms that have some teeth, where there's sanction. Don't necessarily have to be a criminal sanction. It could be fines, significant fines, whether those are to institution or individuals who have responsibility for providing stewardship over the resources of taxpayers, the public purse. Similarly, it would be helpful at a minimum if political parties are legally required to indicate who are their benefactors, who are their financiers, and disclose the sums that were donated for the purposes of political activities. To the extent that information is made public, when contracts are awarded to particular individuals or government procurement in the form of buying, purchasing goods or services, substantial amounts of government spending is directed to a particular source, the public have the benefit, again, or interested parties, of comparing to see to what extent there's any quid pro quo or any conflicts of interest there. That would perhaps be a minimum standard. There are those that would argue that because of that type of transparency, persons would shy away from contributing to political parties in the manner that they do. And let's all face the real world. We need money. Churches need money. Political parties need money to meet their obligations or finance their core functions and obligations. So it begs the question, and I know that the public tends to balk at any association of public funds being directed for political purposes. But a question could be, should Barbados move to a model where political campaigns and elections are financed from the public purse? I think most people will hasten to say no, but guess what? we already pay for political the financing of political parties. We pay for it through misallocation of public funds. Yeah, I'm not hearing you, Mr. Stewart.
Sorry, that was muted. That's a very interesting perspective. I was gonna to interrupt to ask you that question. Should we outlaw the
Okay, sorry. Yeah,
yeah,
I'm hearing you
should
now.
we should we outlaw the receiving of campaign finances from private individuals and companies? Or if you do receive it, you have to register that funding saying you got XYZ from XYZ person, and you have to make that public. Should we outlaw the receipt of those monies and then ask the government through the Electoral and Boundaries Commission to regulate political parties and how they receive those funds, and to say to the political parties, well, look, the government of Barbados is going to put aside, let's just say, this is a rough figure, $2 million, $3 million, whatever. And you would use this and stay within budget to be able to fulfill your duties as a political organization, because we don't want any conflicts of interest where, for example, a businessman donates $1 million to your political party and then you have to give him every single contract of the public purse, much to the disadvantage of the people. So you rightfully said, Carlos, people would balk at the idea, but look, this is what it can solve. And situations where ministers are receiving private checks, all of that could be stopped. Situations where companies donate largely to political parties, and then you have situations where the same company is getting contract or after contract after contract. All of that could be stopped uh, with such a suggestion, right? So, freedom of information, which is very important, the Freedom of Information Act, which would then allow uh, all public records to be published out there for public consumption, along with reforms which says to political parties that if you receive any type of campaign finances from private sources, it must be declared. And if you don't declare it, then there will be some stern repercussions for not declaring it, because we don't want potentially embarrassing situations, not necessarily on the individual, but for the country, which increases, and you're familiar with this term as an economist, Carlos, the country risk, as international investors do sit and watch the potential for corruption and what risks exist as it relates to them having a fair shot at procuring government contracts and to ensure that the process is free, fair, and transparent.
No, it's an important point because there are some countries, for example, Canada is one, the Netherlands is another, where um, the government or the legal framework is as such that individuals or companies can be prosecuted for engaging in what could be deemed under their legislation to be corrupt practices in a foreign country. So you can see clearly there where if the standards and with respect to public finances do not meet the standards in other countries, whether it's institutional investors, again, or individuals, or even a private or a public company that is a construction company. We've had a company called Trieste in the past being contracted to expand the highway. It was I suppose it came to light later on that some of the principals of that company were engaged or found to have engaged in some corrupt practices in another location for which there were sanctions. The point is that even though there may be the willingness to invest because of certain prudential controls and satisfying their own domestic legislation, they may not go forward and invest if, as you say, there's a perception of corruption, or if in a real way, the business people met with government officials, and there was some indication that they require some quid pro quo or some payment or donation in exchange for approvals of some sort. Right. So these are real issues that have some material impact on not only country risk, but also foregone potential investment, foregone potential foreign direct investment that the country may have otherwise had, but was not able to capitalize on because the principals were skittish on account of the standards not being to the level that they are satisfied with for their own ethics or in accordance with the legislative provisions that they have to comply with in their home countries. So these are important issues. And again, if you're aspiring to be developed, if you're aspiring to be developing, that is not just featured in building new buildings or building new roads, but that is in improving systems, not only systems of governance, but systems of the provision of public services to the public, where they're able to see some material improvement in the services that they receive from government, but also where government engages in procurement. And when we talk about over $4 billion in expenditure, that all of that is procurement. That is money that is spent. About a third of it is spent in wages and salaries, but the rest of it is goods and services, capital investment, machinery, etc. Whether it's equipment for the hospitals, equipment for the schools. That's a lot of money in public procurement that is distributed throughout the economy. And if that money is misallocated on account of trying to balance interests, the public interest with partisan interests, then the question becomes: are Barbadians getting the value for money from the taxes that they pay? And again, this is not a partisan issue. This has more to do with and improvements in governance.
Yeah, we have someone from here near Royal Eastman. The last Royal Eastman I know is the former representative for St. James North from the Barbados Labour Party. So this person has a very interesting name, Royal Eastman. But Royal Eastman is asking here, how would you be able to trace cash bribes? Now, here's the thing. This is where you have independent committees that could be set up to investigate. There's the anti-corruption unit, which exists within government, and there are the respective bodies that can investigate uh, bribery if they want to, right? So people say, "Man, it will be hard to trace." It's not that hard to trace. I could tell you from personal experience that
But not
if
everyone would be caught. But if
yes,
there's sufficient of a legal framework in terms of legislation, enforcement, detection, and sanction in the courts, that acts in some ways as a deterrent as well. So people will still engage in it, but they know that if they get caught, they're sanctioned. I don't think any of us can realistically say, because it has not happened, that there's any sanction to politicians engaging or being found to have engaged in corrupt practices, right? So, in the same way that, we have a drug, illegal drug industry, in all forms of illegal drugs. In Barbados' case, marijuana is still for recreational use illegal, though legal in some jurisdictions like the one that I'm currently in. Cocaine, heroin, etc. This is a trade that is largely done in cash, but people still find themselves before the law courts when they are detected or interdicted, and they're sanctioned, criminally. right? So it isn't a question of, the expectation that you have to be able to trace every transaction that occurs in cash, um, in this case with respect to bribes and so on. In the same way that you aren't expected to trace every transaction that occur in the illegal drug trade. But yet there is a legal framework where the activity not only is deemed to be illegal, contrary to the public interest, but when caught, there are criminal um, sanction, right? And is an interesting question because the question almost implies that nothing can be done um, to address this particular concern, right? I don't think we throw our hands in the air with respect to whether it is illegal drugs or um, fraud, whether that's blue collar fraud, white collar fraud, or an individual trying to defraud someone. There is the expectation that as a society, we frown on these types of activities, and there's a legal framework that if you're caught, and there is some measure of enforcement mechanisms that you face sanction. Why should public officials, including politicians, be insulated from that type of scrutiny?
Yes. Well, thank you, Carlos. I hope that answers your question, audience, because I feel very strongly about this. I personally went through campaigns where I faced the risk of potentially becoming corrupted, and they say facing the risk because as soon as you show interest in politics, there is the avenue for funds and to be receiving funds. Well, we understand the culture of politics in Barbados, and recently it has graduated to a huge fanfare, almost like a big Burna Boy or Rihanna concert, where you have to have all of the extra stuff to be considered. This is only by perception to be considered a viable political entity, but there are some drawbacks to that level of campaigning. So, while that level of campaign is expected uh, from the culture, and I say culture, I mean the voters to some extent, not maybe, I'm not speaking in totality, but this is a broad, that's a broad observation. There are serious drawbacks. We saw uh, shirts given out. I mean, like, all across the island, we saw hats, whistles, blowers. Uh, we saw the big platforms, the big stages. But all of these things come with investment. And political parties are not in the business of making money. So the money has to come from somewhere, and this money usually comes from donors. And you don't.
Foreign and domestic.
Correct. Um, so if you become beholden to donors, I'm not saying that there aren't donors who would be genuinely supportive of the cause and would give you something, but they give you something with the expectation, if you want to acknowledge it or not, that some type of benefit, monetary or otherwise, will be returned uh, to the place of origin. Now, I wanted to move on from that conversation because I think you really made the point there, Carlos. And I wanted to acknowledge the fact that we are having, or we're at 357 persons tonight. This is a record viewing, Carlos. Usually we go up to 2,500 views, 2,000 views after the fact. But the numbers
Okay.
are definitely climbing, so the conversation tonight is rich. I am enjoying it. I'm sure the audience is enjoying it. There's a hive of activity going on in the comments. People still contributing. But I want to shift over to my next question. And I think a lot of persons will want to hear about that. So we're going to first touch on the debt situation.
Mhm.
And then I want to touch on this thing about prices and the supermarkets, because at the end of the day, and I just want to, just luckily I found this shirt, and this shirt has no connection to the show, but this is just how God works. It says hustle, right? And it says here, working smart to make money, right? So usually people will ask, well, what is your hustle? What do you do? What is yours? People say, well, I have a job and I also have a side hustle,
Yeah.
right? And we in Barbados have jobs, but we also have to have a side hustle to be able to subsidize the fact that the cost of living in Barbados is becoming, or like, it is absurd and reaching levels that are out to the reach of the average. We will see a low income earner. We're seeing a dwindling middle class as well. And we are hearing persons, we even heard Anderson Cherry, a very high income earner in Barbados, crying out about having a hard time under the Barbados economy. But we'll get to that after we discuss the debt situation. But I wanted to take a quote here, kind of lost the page as well, from Alternate Views, right? And the question basically started up with saying that people wanted to know about this level of borrowing, right? And the foreign reserves, right? Um, I quoted Alternate Views and saying here, it was an article I wrote in Barbados today. I saw you had some comments surrounding it as well. The reporter mentioned your name. He also mentioned my name in part of the article. We were both arguing that government's habit of borrowing was becoming a little bit hefty, and we had at the time the person who's now the governor of the central bank defending government borrowing and saying that the government was not borrowing too much. And he said, and according for Alternative Views, he denied that Barbados was not in wrong for another uh, set of austerity measures to fix the current problems that we're having. And he made it very clear that the high debt to GDP levels that we have, which were bordering around 154% at the time, that we were definitely not, it was definitely not too much. And when queries were raised whether external borrowings were becoming excessive, and if the economy will be in a position to earn sufficient foreign exchange to repay external loans, Dr. Kevin Greenlee stated that the Barbados government is not borrowing too much. And at the time of his comment, foreign loans amounted to approximately 308 million Barbados dollars were announced by lenders, causing some speculation about the pickup in external borrowings. Um, to put the country's debt situation into context, Dr. Greenwich recalled that prior to the onset of COVID-19, Barbados' debt to GDP was around 176%, and it fell from that amount during birth to 117%. And we both know that was not because of any improvements in the economy, but a debt restructuring, right? Over the
Yeah.
pandemic,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
over the pandemic, the debt level went back up to 153%. And Dr. Greenwich argued that the 36 percentage points increase in the ratio, only 5 percentage points can be related to an increase in the stock of debt or new borrowings, and the remaining 31 percentage points came about from the decline in GDP, right? So, what are your comments about that?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot. You've said a lot there, and there are a lot of, I suppose, technical issues that are embedded in the commentary that you just give. Uh, you know, for those who may have heard some of my comments publicly, whether that is on the radio or comments of mine carried in the press, you will know that I do not accept the government's assertion that when they came to office, the debt that they found was, first, they stated $16 billion. Then we heard some years later it was 17, and they have rested more recently on the figure of $18 billion. I don't accept any of those figures.
Those are not
Um,
accurate. These are not
the
accurate.
what the government did, and any of you can find the central bank's reports from prior years showed what the level of public debt was before May 2018 and even after May 2018 under Governor Haynes, Governor Delaware, and then Governor Haynes. The official reporting from the central bank showed that the debt was in the region of $15.8 billion when the current administration came to office. What the government has explained is that they added arrears, and arrears come in different forms. You have arrears from judgments against the government in the past. So a good example would be the Al-Barak judgment, which grew to over $70 million. But you would have various judgments that would count as arrears. You had income tax returns and VAT returns, basically tax returns that under the previous administration were allowed to mount up. Those would count as arrears. You had government procuring services, or we heard recently about contractors not being paid. Again, this is not something that's unique to any particular administration. Those two would be counted as arrears. You have contingent liabilities such as government guarantees to various entities. I do recall in the past that government used to provide loan guarantees for the Barbados Light and Power. There's not, Light and Power isn't going to default on its debt, has never defaulted on its debt, but it would be on government's books as a contingency. Other sources of arrears, besides the ones that I already mentioned, all of those things the government pretty much lumped together and added them to the national debt and say that the national debt was this amount. What I have challenged the government to do, and the governor of the central bank, which they have not done, is to give the public a detailed breakdown of what those arrears were by category, whether they were tax returns, money due to judgments against the government, goods and services that the government had procured but did not pay for, etc. Provide a detailed accounting of what those arrears were, and also tell the public how much of those arrears were written off as part of the debt restructuring exercise. So, for example, the country is aware that the government wrote off, I don't remember the exact figure, but a substantial amount of money in the hundreds of millions of dollars in taxes that were due to the government.
$1 billion in VAT and income tax. They're going to look for you exactly.
So the government has told the public but that's just one side of the ledger. The government would have also written off, let's use that as an example, money or returns that would have been due to various companies, and to quote their rationale. Some of these companies may have even been closed, and therefore you just have these amounts on your books that cannot be recovered. So the point that I'm making is you have to account for both sides of the ledger, and these arrears are not public debt in the definition of public debt, and that's why they would not have appeared in the central bank's reporting, and they would not be considered as public debt by the IMF or any international agency.
Hold a second. I did studies at the International Monetary Fund, and I did a course called Public Sector Debt Statistics. And under that course, it taught me how the government, well, not the government, but how the IMF prescribes to go about including arrears in public debt. Right? So I understood what happened with the government of Barbados and how they were able to include arrears into the public debt system, which is not a correct measurement of the debt stock, in agreement with your point, right? Um, However, since the changes under the new Public Financial Management Act and the inclusion of the IMF into our policy space, reporting requirements changed, and as you said, there is a big difference in the way how now the current governor reports as opposed to how previously Dr. Warren reported or Cleviston Haynes reported. But that was just a FYI that the IMF, it came from the IMF as a prescription, and I say that because in the course public sector debt statistics, it taught us how to include arrears into the government's debt stock.
And that is fine, but it is also convenient because there's what is called the central bank basis and also the IMF basis and even recording the foreign reserves, for example, right? So these are different standards akin to accounting standards, and let me be clear: the arrears had to be brought to book because the exercise of mounting up such large sums in arrears, again, over administrations, even though the Stewart administration may have been the most egregious in doing so. Some of these arrears would have dated back even before the Stewart administration, and I dare anyone, they would have included the Oinata administration, of which the Prime Minister was a key figure in that administration. The point is that the need not to be seeking to mamagai the public or pull wool over people's eyes, but rather, yes, you recognize that arrears have to be brought to book, but those arrears should be properly accounted for. And likewise, how those arrears were paid down or written off should also be properly accounted for, so that the public has a clear sense of what the state of affairs were in terms of the official national debt, in terms of the arrears, how long did those arrears go back to, the breakdown of those arrears, and how were those arrears paid down or written off. Now, the failure to do so is to conveniently, by accounting, seek to boost the public debt numbers, right? And then slash them similarly, some of which would have been slashed by accounting in the same way that some of the VAT write-offs due to the government would have been written off on the basis of accounting. And it makes the government looks good. Government was able to through a restructuring exercise, to reduce debt so significantly, and then to benchmark future debt against 18 billion as opposed to 15.8 billion. It does make the government's performance look far better than it is in actuality, doesn't it? So my contention really has been, like we spoke about transparency earlier, to be more transparent in its accounting to the public with respect to the composition of the debt, the official debt, what we know as government taking on loans, government securities, and so on, and comparing that to government securities and loans that are taken on henceforth, right? As opposed to arrears that were brought to book, that were not previously brought to book, stretching back decades, not a decade, and then writing off most of those arrears and saying, well, you reduced the debt by this significant magnitude, and debt has not yet reached those levels. Now, the facts are, and I would quote from the central bank's report, up to March 2018, the debt was $15.8 billion. Up until December 2023, the debt is $14.7 billion. So just on the absolute numbers alone, we know that the government, on account of its excessive borrowing over the past 6 years, notwithstanding the debt restructuring, the country is just $1.1 billion shy of the level of debt that they came and found that was deemed to be unsustainable. And that is really the issue here. Now, why does government have more flexibility than it did, or that the previous government did, is because part of the debt structuring exercise, they were able to extend maturities and reduce the payments that would be due on debt, and also the interest rates were reduced. Hence, the pain to those who would have invested in government's paper, including treasury bills, which are a short-term instrument that all of a sudden you're going to be repaid in a number of years. The writing off of $1.1 billion owed to the central bank and another $1.3 billion owed to the NIS, that subsequently put the INS sustainability in peril.
Also, the treasury bills as well.
A demonstration that any type of economic endeavor is not without trade-offs. Where you gain on one hand, you lose on the other. So that really is the point of the issue with respect to the debt. Now, the governor of the central bank and the government likes to use the singular measure. It's a acceptable standard, but it's not the only measure of assessing the sustainability of debt. They prefer to just use debt to GDP ratio because the debt is taken as a proportion of the size of the economy, nominal GDP in particular. So once you get nominal GDP growing, which it will grow over time, and in particular, if it grows faster than your buildup in debt, well, on account of simple math, the debt to GDP ratio will decline. And that is why it shot up during the pandemic, because economic activity collapsed during the pandemic, not only in Barbados, but virtually across the world. And therefore, the numerator shrank, and you're dividing by a smaller number, so you're going to get a bigger result. Once that economic activity came back, once the lockdowns were lifted, that debt to GDP ratio went down. And the governor at the time did rightly explain, well, that would have been the previous governor, Clevis and Haynes, that would have been expected, and therefore, when it shot up, it was not a cause for concern, even though that if you focus on that singular number, it would appear on the surface that is some cause for concern. And that underscores the point, really, that using that metric alone is not a satisfactory metric in determining whether debt is sustainable going forward. And there's no doubt that the rate at which the government has borrowed in the past 6 years, that should it continue to borrow at that rate, that it would put the country's future in peril. Now, notwithstanding what the government says or have said publicly, the government recognizes this. And sometimes it's best to pay attention more to people's actions than their words. And if you look at the current estimates in particular, you would see that the government in the next financial year is expecting to borrow predominantly from the domestic market as opposed to the foreign market, in recognition that such a significant buildup in foreign debt has serious implications in the future. And I want to be clear about this. There isn't a debt problem right now as we speak. And all I've said in the public space in the past, and privately too, is that should the government continue to borrow at the rate at which it was borrowing in the past 6 years, the country could end up in a debt trap, as it did in 2018. Again, I'm confident that the government, notwithstanding what they say publicly, has recognized that, and they've already pivoted, so to speak. I, myself, and others have indicated, Kimar, you have been in the vanguard of that as well. but also very respected economist, experienced economist, Professor Michael Howard, um, economist Anthony Wood, Professor Justin Robinson, and others have raised the alarm about the extent to which the government was relying predominantly on foreign debt, not by choice, but because of the unintended consequences of the debt restructuring, not being able to borrow sufficiently from domestic sources, be those banks, insurance companies, or individuals, because they got burned during the debt restructuring. I am pleased to say that in the current estimates that are before Parliament, the government, in its budgeting, has clearly signaled that it wants to return, or it expects to return, to relying more on the domestic market to finance its deficit than on the foreign market. Now, the question is whether they would succeed in doing so. And the jury is out on that.
Thank you, Carlos. I just wanted to um, read something here from Alternate Views. That's a comment you raised. And it was just an addition to what you were saying. It says that the minister at the time declared that the Barbados Revenue Authority was carrying on its books amounts owing to that organization since 1968, most of which was in government's estimation uncollectible, and that the BRA had recommended to the Ministry of Finance that it write off all taxes owed from the years of tax years of 1968 to 2000, and it was recommended that all outstanding payments for the years of 2000 to 2017 have all interest and penalties due and owing waived as long as outstanding payments are made or a payment plan agreed to with the BRA. And that total just over $1.7 billion that was just written off in income taxes, VAT, and the like owing to the Barbados Revenue Authority. Um, you also mentioned, and I think I mentioned this point, that Barbados is under the IMF program, BERT, and BERT was essentially there to restructure uh, structural adjustment in the political economy of the country and with the domestic debt profile, because quite a few persons do not understand the construct of our debt, be it local debt or foreign debt. um, I mentioned in other spaces that White Oaks only agreed to restructure $973 million, but $910 million, sorry, of foreign debt under the debt restructuring, right? So we jumped from approximately 1 point some billion in outstanding foreign debt to a figure of over 5 billion um, in a very short space of time. And some persons wanted to understand the construct of our debt and to paint in some of those areas. Most of the debt that Barbados had, Mr. Fort, was domestic debt owing to the central bank, owing to the national insurance, or persons owning treasury bills, and in arrears. As you rightfully said, we were not that heavily indebted to international financial institutions or on the international financial markets. But in terms of politicians, and they try to separate politicians from economists, but you can't, because the politicians are really the spokespersons for economic policies of government. Um, there was this thing going on about foreign reserves. Foreign reserves. Barbados is drilling in foreign reserves. But I want to read a piece here from Alternate Views. It says here, around 2018, government was forced to start cutting its import bill, and the prices, general prices increased, and there were allegations of a shortage of imported goods in the country. And there were some instances of shortages in imported goods. And the idea was that cuts will preserve our reserves that were very low at the time as they start to deteriorate faster than the government could have sustained. However, the prime minister at the time, Mr. Stewart, and the finance minister were indicated that they did not want to go to the International Monetary Fund to be able to top up foreign reserves. For the very same reason is that the IMF has traditionally been known to trespass on your public policy and place conditionalities on the table that are very restrictive, right? If you look at what Barbados spends most of its foreign exchange on is fuel and merchandising, right? And to expand on the complexity of the problem, um, today, or what will come, is debt service and being able to repay those debts. Now, a lot of persons may not know this, but Barbados was not paying any debts, like domestic. And we had some leeway as it relates to repaying foreign debt, but that has now come to an end, and Barbados is now starting to repay international debt service. And I read the estimates, and I'm sure you may have them, but the debt service of Barbados is bordering close to $1 billion. Right?
Yeah, it's
And
just over 900 million
yes,
dollars. And as I I I used to say, as a young economist, not far removed from university, when I worked at the Ministry of Finance there. Um, of course, but at that time, debt service wasn't that large. I think it was maybe in the region of $450 million or so, subject to correction. And I used to muse to myself, imagine what the country could do with 450 million every year. And that's perhaps the way you can think of it. Imagine what Barbados could do or could have done had it not built up so much debt over its post-independence history. And it had available to it $900 million over and above what it spends now to invest in schools, healthcare, capital works, fixing roads, etc. It's a lot. It's a lot of money, and it dwarfs government's capital spending annually, which in the next financial year is budgeted to be about just over about, I think the number is about $220 million. So actually $217 million that the government would be spending in capital works and so on, investment into the future economic capacity of the country. Imagine if that number was 900 million that is being paid to service debt in interest and to pay principal that may be due. And so the same is true for an individual. If you become too indebted over time, if you're honoring your obligations, you have fewer dollars that you can divert to spending or investing. And the same is true for the government, and that is why it is important or prudent not to spend above your means. And a deficit in the region of 2% of GDP annually is considered to be sustainable. But nothing is wrong with, in good times, running a surplus or running a balanced budget, either so that you don't accumulate debt. You give yourself some room for when there's economic downturns or shocks, where invariably you would have to increase spending and borrowing and so forth. So, that is why it's not maybe a sexy subject electorally, because it's only when the roosters come home to roost that the public may, raise the alarm or be concerned, and that comes in the form of higher taxes down the road. It comes in the form also of reduced services or layoffs in the public sector and so on, or when an adjustment or tightening of the belt have to occur. But it doesn't occur in a vacuum. It occurs against the background of a preceding period where, as a nation, not a political party, not an administration, you're living above your means. You're making promises that the country really can't afford you enjoy the sweets perhaps in the short term and have to pay the piper in the future. To put the question of domestic debt and foreign debt into perspective, for many decades, most borrowing, and this is prudent financial management, it's not unique to Barbados, would occur, most public sector borrowing would occur locally. And a part of the reason that is that as a risk management measure, it's usually easier to roll over that debt. When it becomes due, you issue some more bonds locally, and you roll over the debt. It is harder to roll over foreign debt because foreign debt isn't always easily accessible. So though it is accessible now, we could recall a period not so long ago when, because of the country's debt profile, because of the bad shape of the public finances, the country found it difficult to borrow money internationally. So what we're saying is that you can't just think about now or the next 5 years. You have to plan 10, 15, 30 years down the road. And because the country has had a chronic perpetual problem of not earning enough foreign exchange, it is a reasonable assumption that, save an economic miracle, it will continue to have a chronic problem earning foreign exchange in the future, and therefore it would have to rely on borrowing in foreign currency to repay the foreign debt that is being built up now when it becomes due. So that is why it's an important consideration. But again, to put it in perspective, the composition of government's debt profile used to be about 80% domestic debt, 20% foreign debt. That ratio has shifted to about 60% domestic debt, 40% foreign debt in just 6 short years. That is a significant departure from Barbados's public policy anchor across administrations over the last 55 years or so. But again, I want to stress that notwithstanding the government's defensive musings when these issues have been raised publicly by me and others, that the government, they have a lot of economic advisors, and I would say that, they have a de facto Minister of Finance, that in the form of the Minister in the Ministry of Finance, that has some competence in the field. And notwithstanding what they've been saying publicly, they too recognize that that is not a sustainable policy. It is not a policy that can resound to the benefit of the country in the medium to long term. And the government has admitted that in its estimates of revenue and expenditure by saying in the next financial year, we are going to be relying, as was the tradition, as was part of the public policy anchor, more on domestic debt and less on foreign debt. So what is that expected to look like? Well, it means that in the next financial year, the government is expected to, is budgeting to borrow, and this is in Barbados dollars, the foreign currency equivalent to 441 Barbados dollars, as compared to the current financial year where it borrowed or is on track to borrow 780.8 million Barbados dollars in foreign currency. So that is a significant shift in policy. Similarly, it's budgeting to borrow $628.1 million domestically, and that compares with a paltry $144 million that is on track to borrow domestically this year. So clearly the government has recognized the error of its ways. In some ways, it isn't so much that is an error, but by necessity, the government had to rely on foreign borrowing in circumstances where, because of the aftermath of the debt restructuring, domestic investors have not been so willing to lend the government money. Now, whether the government, so this is policy, whether they succeed in this shift is left to be seen. That will depend largely on the appetite of domestic investors to purchase government securities in the region of the 628 million that the government would be seeking to borrow from domestic investors in the coming financial year.
Yeah.
So, not unlike governments, and I would wrap it up on this. Well, wrap up the response on this point.
Yes.
Not unlike individuals who, you are minded to be guided more than by their actions than their words. The government is not dissimilar in that respect, notwithstanding their bluster. They too recognize that the course that they're on is not sustainable and has to be corrected.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Carlos, for the extensive explanation. Um, I just want to make a comment, and because we're running down, the time is running out on us. So I just want to make a quick contribution. Then we got to address the supermarket prices. Something that impacts all of us. And then we want to get maybe a caller or two, and then we can wrap up quickly. But you made a point that Barbados has a perpetual problem of foreign exchange earnings, right? As far back as Prime Minister Tom Adams, where he had to go to the International Monetary Fund, that was the first time Barbados went to the IMF under Prime Minister Adams. We fast forward now to Sir Lloyd Sandiford. We went to the International Monetary Fund under him as well. Then fast forward, we have Prime Minister Mia Mottley. She went to the IMF as well, and the problem was almost the same. A problem of Barbados earning foreign exchange, notwithstanding that some policy actions were taken to lead us to that point. But that is not the point of argument on this point. So just to quote here, um, what I found that our ministers of finance do not address is that of balance of payments and the construct of investments, exports and imports, and overall national income into a country, right? Um, investment, and I'm reading from alternate views here again. Investment, and we classify investment as the money that the IMF and the IDB give to us in this sense, not foreign direct investment, but investment from multilateral sources. Um, I'm paraphrasing here, does not suffice to cure the problem, the chronic problem that we have of not earning foreign exchange, right? But investment in a country is intended to give rise to exports, and how we export goods and services to be able to earn foreign exchange, right? Barbados receives high level or has traditionally received high levels of foreign investment, but still experiences habitual slides in foreign reserves, and that could be attributed to the fact that Barbados does not achieve trade surpluses constantly or significantly enough to have any major increases in income on our balance of payments, right? And when there are general upswings in terms of money coming into a country, like how we had an upswing of foreign money coming into the country from those sources, it increased our foreign reserves. However, the current status of our foreign reserves, Mr. Ford, in Barbados, we call that artificial standing, in that you didn't earn it, you just borrowed it, and saying that you have X amount of billions, right? That money came from the IMF, the CDB, the IDB, the World Bank, the European Investment Bank. We know them all, right? The problem is, and I guess the public is saying, we are borrowing all this debt, but there's no channel to be able to mobilize this investment into revenue generating sources for the expansion of current or new goods and services in the Barbados economy, which gives us avenues for new growth areas, potential for new foreign exchange earnings. Even if you look at the traditional making and getting rid of the old stuff that no longer generates enough foreign exchange, and restructuring those areas, as the increased reserves only assisted in benefiting people who major players who need the foreign exchange. As we know, Trinidad has a very big hook in Barbados. Trinidad uses quite a bit of Barbados' foreign exchange as it relates to private sector development. We have some big conglomerate companies here in Barbados who use our foreign exchange, but there's no link to have the reserves, and I suspect the link is supposed to be the government. There's no link to have these reserves connected or where a development policy to increase the possibility of earned income for locals, which places a severe tax burden on an already overtaxed and a shrinking tax base. And the more borrowed reserves that we have, it increases the greater adjustment which must be made locally, and the Barbadian taxpayer will be required to pay higher prices, which will be our next topic, to bring the economy back into a balance. Any ease and adjustment will have to come from government intervention. So if you could give me a quick comment there.
Yeah,
Um,
I'll be quick. I will say though it's a very, and I commend you, Kimar. It's a very cogent description of the fundamental challenges that have confronted the Barbados economy and public policy, and certainly it is the central problem or challenge that confront, I believe, economists in the country, and economists like myself who may not be physically there, but as a Barbadian born and raised with a commitment to its development, it's a challenge that arrests our attention in terms of trying to come up with solutions. And suffice to say that the only exception to the time period is the tenure of former Prime Minister Owen Arthur. During that time, the country, it's not occasion to go to the IMF, had pretty robust reserves, though some borrowed. That period was punctuated by significant foreign investment, predominantly in the tourism-related development, directly and indirectly. And we're borrowing from international sources as a stopgap measure. Foreign direct investment that flows in but does not have long-term legs in terms of foreign exchange earning capacity after that investment is made. And in the case of Barbados, a lot of that investment has been real estate type investment during the Owen Arthur years. Not a bad thing, and some tourism capacity, accommodations capacity was built during that time, but that too, in a sense, is a stopgap measure. And perhaps it ran its course up to a point, because Barbados has not been able to recover that level of investment or attract that level of investment during those that was seen during those 13 years. It is part of the reason why now Governor of the Central Bank, who previously was one of the architects of the government's programs 1 and 2, in particular 2, you still hear the governor stressing or emphasizing the need to increase investment, both domestic investment and foreign investment, if the country is to achieve the lofty growth target of 4 to 5% growth over the next 2 to 3 years. Part of that is a calculated metric, again, based on when the economy grew at a sustainable basis. I think is the longest period of economic expansion, again, during the Owen Arthur years. basically, those targets are predicated on similar levels of both foreign and domestic investment. The proof of the pudding is ultimately going to be in the eating as to whether Barbados can attract that level of development. Again, some of the reasons that you cited, the cost of living and the cost of doing business have increased, eroding competitiveness, both for businesses already established there and businesses that may be contemplating investing in the country. There's also the what was formerly called the international business sector, which have shrunk. Many of the factors due to developments outside of Barbados. But the point is that neither the Stewart administration or so far the Motley administration has been able to reverse the fortunes in that sector. And that sector was a source of not only foreign significant earnings of foreign exchange in the form of export services, of which tourism is also export, service export, but also the prospect for new investment in that sector. The sector has been declining rather than expanding. So that's another source of significant investment that the country, inward investment or foreign direct investment that the country has lost. By virtue of the nature of those entities that being domiciled in Barbados, they would have kept high levels of foreign exchange in the country as well, which would have helped to ensure that there are adequate levels of foreign exchange in the commercial banking system and less of a propensity to see the foreign reserves being drawn down. So there's a array of issues where clearly the country is less competitive than it was in the late 90s to early 2000s. And we see the result of that in terms of the economic fortunes. The growth that we've seen over the last the post-pandemic growth, are largely post-pandemic growth, a rebound from reopening the economy, seeing tourism come back to or approach levels that it was in 2019 and so forth. So the jury is still out. And I think this year would be a defining year as to whether the government can sustain a level of growth that is around 3%. It's probably a more realistic number, and sustain that level of growth going forward. But the public policy challenge remain: how is the country able to sufficiently diversify existing industries and diversify into new industries to not only attract higher levels of foreign direct investment, but to attract the type of foreign direct investment that builds out capacity that is capable of earning foreign exchange in the future. And it is against that background that I said, the extract that you read or wrote rather, was quite a comprehensive description of I would say, the central issue that Barbados faces with respect to its development, its economic and social development. Yeah, again, I'm not hearing you. I don't know if it's on my end or
Sorry,
not.
That's me.
Okay.
Right. Yes. So thank you for that explanation. Quite comprehensive as always. But 9:30 is upon us, so time is definitely getting away from us. So we want to do a quick expose on consumer prices, inflation, going into the supermarket. The price of everything in Barbados is high. Um, we pay some of the highest rates of duties and taxes. We buy, if you want things like t-shirts, 100% duties on t-shirts. All of the imports, or majority of the imports into the products that we produce locally come from overseas, right? So
Yeah.
even trying to produce local, there's still that element that we have to import most of the inputs. And that when you go into supermarkets now, we had previously we had supermarkets like Ritz and Jar, mainly local supermarkets. But with the selling off of the Barbados shipping and trading during the 1.5 period, we saw the introduction of new chains, and more recent, we are seeing like massive and much larger conglomerates coming into Barbados, setting up, and the prices. I have been speaking to quite a few persons. Um, Food prices are high, transportation costs is high, even the price of water um, is going up. Basic necessities are getting out of the hands of regular people. So, what's to say about those luxury items now, uh, Carlos? This is saying to me that in Barbados, you have a chunk of the population who will be caught in the hamster wheel of consumerism, hardly ever really getting to the aspect of being able to enjoy leisure items like
Yeah.
travel and entertainment and party if the basic cost of living for essential items are so high. And we hear the governors of the central bank are constantly referencing this ideal, this new ideal, because really new in terms of the Barbadian context of an inflation dividend. It may not be new to us as person studied in the area of finance and economics, but for the public, hearing this thing about inflation dividend, the price of inflation is increasing. They may understand the term inflation as in that high prices, right? But help the small man here and know to understand and to give us your understanding, sorry, of the inflation in Barbados, why prices are the way they are. I could say no, I don't see any reduction in substantial reduction in prices, so I wouldn't suggest to my audience to look for it because prices don't ever come down really in economies. Um, but enough of me talking. I want to hear
Yeah.
from
So it's a combination of high level of indirect taxation, and one of the consequences of shifting or to your um, reliance as a government more on indirect taxes than on direct taxes like income taxes and corporate taxes. One of the consequences of that is going to be higher prices. Um, Basic economic taxation theory and policy um, demonstrates that indirect taxes are what we call more regressive, meaning that they have more of an adverse impact on lower income groups than higher income groups, as opposed to progressive income taxes, which tend to tax people who earn more at a higher rate. So even though you may not be paying directly, you're paying indirectly when you go to the supermarket, and there's duties on those products. There's VAT, there's excise taxes. There is the fuel tax because there's a fuel charge for transporting goods, whether it's from the port to warehouses or from warehouses to retail outlets, deliveries, etc. So these taxes are baked in, and to the extent that they're higher taxes, they're baked into the prices. But also, a lot of these taxes are percentage-based taxes. So if you have price levels rising due to imported prices, and not only are you going to have higher prices landed at the port, when you apply all these taxes on those higher prices, you're going to get higher revenues, but you're also going to get higher degree of pain in people's pockets. And that's what the country has been experiencing. On one hand, the government's revenues increases. Its debt to GDP ratio looks better because the nominal GDP is boosted. But people's lived experiences are eroded. Their living standards are eroded because they have to pay higher prices. And I make bold to say that the government, on a point of policy, have chosen to opted for higher revenues as opposed to inflation reduction in the form of providing a tax ease against the background of increasing taxes to stabilize the economy. The economy is now stable and doing according to, if you believe the government spokespersons, it is performing exceptionally well. Now, I don't believe that, so I'm being a little sarcastic here. So on one hand, that's the trade-off, I suppose. I hasten to say it is not only a case, it is not just on account of taxes. Prices have risen across the world coming out of the pandemic due to supply chain issues, the knock-on effects of the war in Ukraine and Russia produce a significant amount of grain and other commodities. Substituting those commodities increase demand in other commodities, which leads to higher prices. The sanctions on Russia, notwithstanding the Western governments would not say or admit to it, have also contributed to the wave of inflation that we saw over the course of the last 2.5 years. So Barbados isn't insulated from that, but a high indirect tax regime compounded those effects. And the government was not impotent. Now, we discussed earlier, the government is expecting to increase, that the revenue would increase without raising any taxes that we know about. The revenue is expected to increase by 320 million. Again, that is partly on account of growth, partly on account of higher prices. So apart from that, we have, let's face it, the country is a small country. Markets are not competitive domestically, whether that is in the supermarket or retail industry, wholesale. We have a few large players, and as you know, Kimar, from studying economics at university and but even outside the university, companies will tax or exact from the market, will charge prices to the extent that the market can bear. We have capitalist models of economic endeavor, and in the capitalist systems, capital strive. Labor is at the mercy of government. The extent to which unions are strong to negotiate a higher share of the proceeds of capitalist endeavor. So you have a situation where the markets are uncompetitive by the very nature on account of smallness and insufficient regulatory regimes. And the reason I say insufficient is because we would have been taught that markets should be competitive, and that government intervention should be shallow or sparse, and let the markets do their thing, and people will strive. The fact is that because small open economies like Barbados are not competitive markets like the United States, Canada, Europe, the European Union, and so on. And therefore, in my view, there is a stronger case for government intervention and regulation, non-tax regulation or intervention, that can curb some of these exploitative practices of the merchant class that ultimately results in consumer welfare deteriorating over time and living standards deteriorating over time. I know my comments would be offensive to the capitalists, but facts are facts, right? Across the world, the imperative of a business is to increase their profits over and above what their profits were the year before. And that is especially true of public companies, because their rewards are based on that pursuit and that endeavor. If you have a small country, relatively small population, you're going to, as a business person, if your singular focus being on your shareholders for the most part, at least your primary focus, you're going to extract as much from the market as it can bear. So does that happen in Barbados? Of course it does. Yes, some of those price increases would be legitimate, but companies would take the opportunity, as they have done even in the United States, where studies have shown that about 50% of the inflation, the post-pandemic inflation, were attributable to increases in corporate profits. This is research from not just a single research paper, but research based on different sources. It's a phenomenon that isn't common in the United States, being a large competitive economy, but I suppose the post-pandemic confluence of events, the supply chain issues, supply shortages, etc., provided significant government supports in the form of stimulus to individuals and so on, provided an environment that the capitalists could have functioned in that way. And it is interesting because it's a phenomenon that I've long described privately to colleagues and friends that are interested in these subjects as the Barbados mercantilist model, which is to exact as much as you can from consumers, so that when their price increases, legitimate price increases on account of costs, prices go up, whether that's oil prices going up or what have you. But when those same inputs prices go down, in terms of the imported inputs, you don't see a commensurate adjustment. You do see those types of adjustments in large dynamic economies. So these are some of the issues that public policy, though have its limitations, can be addressed both by your tax policy and your regulatory policy.
Well, thank you very much, Carlos. We've gone over time, but that is okay. I want to take one or two more questions from the audience, and then we'll sign off. We want to be disciplined in terms of being on the show. I know you're enjoying it. I'm enjoying it. Carlos, we actually went past 400 and some persons at one point. So that is a record number, I must say. So persons are definitely interested in what you were saying and are saying here. Just to cap off onto what you were saying, Barbados is definitely a consumer's economy. If you manage to find yourself with a business venture, you could think how persons have been here. We have this is an area that I want to venture in. How the Muslim Indian community has developed themselves in Barbados to be owners of large sums of capital from practicing basically a wholesale retail model, um, finding alternate routes to doing business. So as opposed to traditional brick and mortar businesses, they started driving vans come around to each person's house and selling items, and then they graduated on to brick and mortar uh, businesses, um, and that has been successful for them. From my side, I want to see something like that happening for the wider population in Barbados. I know it's quite difficult to get a change in mindset as it relates to the habits and the spending habits of a population, away from consumer type behavior into a more productive type, and selling excess production. That production could also be in good or service with the ability to do export on the individual level. But I mean, it's kind of quite difficult to achieve. It comes with extensive hours of trying to re-educate and provide those opportunities for persons, incentives as well for persons to change habits. It's not an easy task. It will definitely require governmental support, private sector. I won't expect to get private sector support, but governmental support, community support, anything that allows persons to have a collective model. Collectivism breeds capitalism, and the more spending power you have, or the more persons you have on board, the more spending power you have. Um, and
Yeah,
sorry.
I would be brief in response and say that it's an example of cooperative economic endeavor. And Barbados has, I guess the significant example of that would be the credit union movement. But I think both the credit union movement and that community, what they have in common is a degree of economic cooperation among each other.
Mm.
And perhaps the relationships among the majority demographic in the population needs to be built where they're able to trust each other, and also put the legal business arrangements in place when they get into business to mitigate risks if it doesn't work out. But that people would cooperate more in um, the pursuit of entrepreneurial endeavor.
Yeah. Right. Well, we're gonna take this last question here, Carlos, because we definitely over the time. So my apologies if I didn't get to all of the questions. Um, my definite apology. Right. We have Tyrone Nurse asking, as we don't want to be too long, Tyrone, my apologies. We just want to just quickly answer and then we're going to try to wrap up. If all of those lands we have here is planted with food, will the economy show a significant difference? Um, that's a broad.
Yeah, it's broad. So the question, you could hazard and say yes, but the question is difference in what way? Would it be a positive difference, or a negative difference? And you know the it, you know it isn't a prospect that would be beneficial. The Barbados used to be a monocrop economy. Most of the lands used to be planted in exportable commodity. It served us well up until a point, but the economy was diversified, and we saw persons' livelihoods and quality of life improving. So I suppose even on the basis of our history, but to be more pointed about it, Barbados is a small place. If you think of the things that people eat, most of it is our processed foods, and in the supermarkets, but even produce and so on. There's a range of things that can't even be grown in Barbados, and some of you may be surprised that a small farm in Canada, a small farm, is about 2 acres. There's a big farm in Barbados. The fact of the matter is that Barbados cannot be competitive in agriculture, and certainly not in a mass scale agriculture. Niche areas, perhaps, but it would probably be better to be realistic and look to countries like Bermuda, Singapore, and others to see how a country can be prosperous by you know uh, pursuing diverse industry, the adoption of technology, and eventually the production of technology, and purchasing the food that you need from those who can produce it cheaper, and to be frank, from those who can afford to subsidize it, like the United States and Europe, on account of billions of dollars that they earn from other industries.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Carlos. We've come to the end of the show. It was a very good discussion tonight. I really enjoyed our discussion. We had record numbers on the stream tonight. Unfortunately, we were unable to take in everybody's question. The conversation was flowing so smooth, and time got away. But we're gonna definitely do this again. Carlos will definitely not be a stranger to the show. He has. We are in contact with each other, so he could come on whenever he has uh, time, and we would have further and more extensive discussions. I will say to you all, the viewers, thank you again for tuning on to Alternate Views yet another Thursday. We're not going to announce our next guest as yet. It will probably be announced probably tomorrow. So look out for that, and we will keep moving from there. This is budgetary season, and we wanted Mr. Ford on, taking time out of his busy schedule. He's not here in Barbados with us. He's in Canada. You all remember we had Mr. Rashid Griffith as well. He was on from Spain. So you see that our reach is growing significantly across the world, and we want to highlight great Barbadians doing great things, patriotic missions. Mr. Ford could easily be in Canada, minding his own business and doing what he has to do over there and not paying attention to what is happening. So we want to highlight his patriotic drive for commenting on issues back here in Barbados. And I really, really, really enjoyed this discussion from the comments, Carlos. Um, people have enjoyed the discussion. We even have Calvin saying here that we need a session on investment for locals. That could be one of our empowering sessions. I'm sure Mr. Ford would love to join in on such a session. So, Mr. Ford, I'm going to give you the last word. But in your last word, could you give us a word for the future? And what does the future hold for Barbados?
Well, I would like to thank you publicly in this forum, Kimar, for affording me the opportunity. Just as with the media in Barbados, I try to avail myself when called upon, notwithstanding my other commitments. Thank you to the audience for tuning in and the questions that you pose. And I do take the relish the opportunity to engage in discussions of public policy and matters concerning the future of Barbados. And I'm pleased that so many people are interested in public affairs and current affairs. And one of the things that I'm guided by when I comment publicly is to help to educate the public on this area of economics and finance, for which I've been privileged to have benefited from the educational foundation in Barbados. So I see it as my way of contributing or giving back, even though that I am far afield. And like many of you, I should say, I want to see Barbados prosper and do well, regardless of which administration is in government or which political party is in government. And I would continue to seek to engage constructively in the public discourse. And I invite all Barbadians to let your voices be heard and your advocacy be felt, because Barbados belongs to all of us.
Well, thank you, Carlos. Please do not forget to tune in tomorrow, everyone, to the Marcia Weeks program at 7 p.m. Don't forget, we'll be having, how we do usually operate. So don't forget to tune in to Marcia uh, tomorrow night. I didn't see her on tonight, so good night to her again, and good night to Dave and the entire team over at the Marcia Weeks Show. Look forward to seeing you over there at 7 p.m. Don't be late. So, Mr. Ford, again, thank you for your conclusion. I really enjoyed it. Um, and this is where we say good night. We didn't get to have any calls, but again, we could do that on a future basis. So have a good weekend, sir.
Good night.
And
And I enjoyed the discussion as well, Kimar. Keep up the good work.
yes, so have a good night, sir, and thank you. This is the end of Alternate Views. Thank you very much, viewers, for tuning in, and we look forward to next week. Don't forget to like this program. Don't forget to share this program, as this has been a very informative session with economist Carlos Ford. So thank you and have a good night.